Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down two of the most, profound and honestly challenging ideas in the Christian faith. What it really means to be a living sacrifice and part of a royal priesthood. Now, these aren't just some stuffy religious phrases. They're basically an invitation to a completely different way of living. So let's get right into it. Okay, so right out of the gate, we're hit with this paradox. The Bible tells believers to offer their bodies as living sacrifices. But wait a minute, how can you be living and also sacrificed? I mean, it sounds like a total contradiction, right? Well, that is exactly the point. We're about to unpack what this powerful, kind of weird idea of a living killing is all about. So here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with the internal stuff, what it means to be a living sacrifice. Then we'll look at what that actually looks like through a really powerful story about surrender. From there, we'll see how that changes everything, turning every believer into a minister, what the Bible calls a royal priest. We'll look at the two practical keys to doing that, and finally, we'll get to the most important part, where the power for any of this comes from.
All right, let's dive into that first phrase, living sacrifice. It's a line that, if you've been around church, you've probably heard it a million times. But when you really stop and look at the original language, you realize it's way weirder and honestly a lot more intense than it sounds at first.
Yeah, this is meant to have some shock value. When Paul wrote this in Romans, he chose his words very, very carefully. The Greek word he used for sacrifice isn't some gentle, poetic term. It's a word for killing. So a living sacrifice is literally a living killing. He's creating this intentional paradox to jolt us, to make us realize that this new life of faith is something absolutely radical.
And this shows just how different it is from the old way of doing things, like with animal sacrifices. Those were about paying for sin. They were temporary, they were bloody, and then they were done. But a living sacrifice, that's not about earning forgiveness. It's a response. It's just pure gratitude. And it's not a one-and-done event. Nope. It's a continuous, moment-by-moment choice to put your own self-will to death.
And this quote just hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? It gets right to the heart of the challenge. An animal sacrifice, it stays put. But a living one, that's us. We are constantly tempted to take back control, to kind of crawl off that altar and say, you know what, actually, I think I know better. It's this perpetual, conscious decision to offer ourselves to God over and over and over again.
So this whole idea of killing your self-will, it can feel pretty abstract, right? So to make it really concrete, one of our sources shares this incredibly powerful story about a young woman who thought she'd surrendered everything, only to find out there was this one thing she was still holding on to for dear life.
So picture this. It's the 1930s. A teenage girl feels this undeniable calling to be a missionary in Asia. She knows it's going to be dangerous and incredibly hard, so she dedicates her entire life to it. She spends years studying, preparing for a life of hardship. She is totally all in. But just as she's ready to go, the mission agency hits her with this final, unexpected requirement. To serve there, she has to be married.
So she goes to God, and she basically makes a deal. She's like, okay, God, my life is yours. I'll go anywhere, I'll do anything. I just need you to do this one thing for me. Just provide a husband. And to her, it seemed like a totally reasonable request. It was a necessary tool for her mission. So for years, she studied and she waited. But no husband, not even a single prospect.
Finally, the night before she graduates from missionary school, she just completely breaks down. She is so angry, she's confused, and she's just wrestling with God, feeling totally betrayed. I mean, from her perspective, she had given up everything. She planned her entire life around this heroic calling, and she felt like God didn't hold up his end of the bargain.
And in that moment of just total despair, she has this incredible realization. She hadn't truly surrendered at all. She had designed this noble, heroic life for herself, and she was basically just using God as a way to achieve her vision. She was telling him what he had to do for her. It wasn't service, it was a transaction.
And this is where the story turns right back around and looks at us. The source asks this really sharp question. If this woman, who was so incredibly dedicated,
willing to give up comfort, safety, her whole future. If she realized she was still holding on, how certain are we that we've truly taken our hands off our own lives? It's a tough question to sit with. Okay, so that internal act of surrender, of taking your hands off, it has this radical external consequence. It completely flips our role in the world on its head. It just demolishes all the old ideas of some kind of spiritual hierarchy and turns every single believer into a minister. See, in the Old Testament, and really in most ancient religions, there was this huge gap between God and regular people. You needed the special experts, the priests, the prophets, to go between for you. But the New Testament comes along and says, nope, because of Jesus, who was the ultimate priest in sacrifice, that chasm is gone. So now, there's no more passive audience and active clergy. Every single believer is brought into what's called this royal priesthood.
So what does being a priest even look like in real life? Well, it's actually part of a threefold calling every Christian has. You minister as a prophet anytime you speak truth in love. You minister as a priest when you serve and encourage other people. And you minister as a king when you give wise direction. And it's not about picking one, it's about learning to live out all three.
Now, I know what you're thinking. That sounds like a massive responsibility. But the source material argues that the reason the early church grew so explosively came down to two really simple but incredibly powerful principles that every single member just put into practice.
That's it. A holy life and an open mouth. Seriously. And holy here just means different. Living a life that looked so compellingly different from the culture around them. And an open mouth just means they were ready to talk about why they were so different when people asked.
So what did this different life actually look like? Well, the source points out that the early Christians just became known for a few things. They were radically honest in their work. They were known for being generous to a fault. They were famous for their hospitality, their commitment to faithfulness in marriage, and their deep care for the well-being of their whole community. It just stood out. This deep integrity is what made people around them get curious.
And when people got curious, they just opened their mouths. And as the source explains, this isn't about getting up and giving some formal sermon. No, it's about the small, everyday things. It's mentoring someone, offering to pray for a neighbor who's going through a tough time, or just sharing a helpful article with a coworker. It's ministry that happens in the normal, natural flow of your life.
And all of this leads us to the final, and really the most important question. Living this way, as a constant sacrifice, as a minister to everyone you meet, it's a radical, demanding call. So where on earth does the power to actually do it come from? The answer is found in this metaphor of the cornerstone.
So back in ancient architecture, the cornerstone was, it was everything. It had to be perfectly shaped, incredibly strong, because the entire building, every wall, every angle, was built based on that one stone. If your cornerstone was solid, your building was solid. Simple as that. The Bible presents Jesus as our cornerstone in three connected ways. First, he's our foundation, the thing that makes us unshakable when life's storms hit. And as you rely on that foundation, he becomes your treasure. He becomes so precious that all the other things we used to chase just lose their shine. And finally, he becomes our example. As the stone the builders rejected, his sacrifice becomes the very power source, the grace that enables our own.
And this is the ultimate contrast right here. Jesus took his hands off his life for you, and he experienced the full, crushing weight of a dying sacrifice. Total separation from God. But because he did that, when you take your hands off your life, you don't fall into nothingness. You fall into his hands. It's a surrender that doesn't lead to death, but to real, actual life.
And that brings us to the last thought from our source material. The text points out that Peter, after that spectacular failure of denying he even knew Jesus, was made a leader in the church. Why? Because there's nothing that makes you a more compassionate minister than knowing just how much you needed grace yourself. So if our biggest mistakes, when they're redeemed by grace, aren't things that disqualify us, but are actually our greatest qualifications, then what are you waiting for?